Welcome back to our final week of geography. Today we'll be talking about the island of Papua New Guinea, although primarily we will actually be talking about the New Guinea side, because you might not realize this, because we often talk about the island, and certainly the books that you have read this year traditionally talk about the island as a whole from a cultural perspective. But the island itself is actually divided between two separate nations. The western half of the island is controlled by the nation of Indonesia, and therefore has a very different flavor, has a very different situation than the eastern side of the island, which is traditionally what we call Papua New Guinea or New Guinea for simplicity's sake, because Papua New Guinea is actually the entire island, and so that part of the country is named after the name of the island. But that gets confusing, so we'll simply refer to that side of the island as New Guinea, just for simplicity's sake in today's lecture. Papua New Guinea is an interesting place, not only because it is a very, very unique place culturally, socially, linguistically, agriculturally, but it's also a very unique place when it comes to European involvement, and certainly it is different from Australia and New Zealand, very, very radically different when it comes to that, for a number of reasons that we will try and go over today in detail. First, let's start with the very, very old history of Papua New Guinea itself. As your book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, talked about significantly, the original inhabitants of New Guinea are different than those who would come later. In fact, there's two waves of immigration into Papua New Guinea, or really you could even say four waves, but we'll exclude the final two for the moment. The first wave of immigration, much like the Australian Aborigines, happened very, very far in the past. Again, evolutionary scientists would say as many as 40,000 years ago, although again we know a significant gap between when people believe they arrived, 40,000 BC, and when they invented agriculture, which is the common evolutionary perspective on when they invented agriculture was 7,000 BC. This leaves us with a 33,000 year period where we have no explainable reason why these people just sat around trying to survive and then finally got around to inventing agriculture after all those years. I think that's because they arrived much less early, and again I would say 7,000 BC also doesn't include time for the flood, but I'm sure it was much closer to when the actual flood occurred, and again I would believe that they would have arrived sometime between 3 and 2000 BC. And I think the evidence of this is the late development of many of their technologies in agriculture. Again, throughout human history, I don't think we see any human group really stagnate as hard as many evolutionary scientists believe the Australian Aborigines and the Papua New Guinea natives did. That many people believe they stagnated for more than 30,000 years. And that is simply ridiculous, because almost every time we have had a chance to study a society, they rapidly advance to the point where they can no longer advance. And certainly that exists. The native Aborigines in Australia could not develop agriculture. They simply did not have the available natural resources to do so. But they did develop everything that they could develop relatively quickly. And again, this is the pattern throughout human history. People tend to develop the things that they're going to develop, and they do it relatively quickly. And then they tend to stagnate. So I can believe that. I can believe a very quick agricultural revolution in Papua New Guinea and then a lack of change. What I really struggle with is a 33,000 year gap before there's any adaptation whatsoever. But that's really a rabbit trail in many ways. That's more science than it is geography and history. Let's get back to the actual geography. So we have an initial settlement by a group of people that we're going to call the Papua New Guinea Aborigines, or the Papua New Guinea natives. And these people seem to have lived in two primary locations. Number one, we have a central highland of Papua New Guinea, which is raised and elevated and much more temperate than the lowland of Papua New Guinea. And it's in this central region of Papua New Guinea that we're going to have significant agricultural development. In highland Papua New Guinea, we have a root called the taro root that is a starchy fiber, very similar to the potato, although nowhere near as high yield. And that is effectively going to be the agricultural staple of central Papua New Guinea. This root can be planted almost anywhere, including on hilltops, which allows this central Papua New Guinea population to grow relatively quickly and relatively large. The problem is that the natives do not seem to be able to form a well put together state or even chiefdom, and many of the people end up as villagers, and they have endemic warfare between themselves that's going to last for the better part of New Guinea's history. The lowland New Guinea natives have a much more difficult time. They have to practice what we sometimes refer to as slash and burn agriculture. What this means is when they moved through, they would effectively forage all native goods, and then they would burn things, basically to find the things that they needed in the remains of everything that they burned, and they would move on and repeat this practice. Now, why this is called agriculture is because this actually is effective at reproducing plants. Specifically, many forests throughout the world, Papua New Guinea not being the exception to this, actually benefit from fires destroying them every 20 to 30 years because many of the low-lying plants cannot survive when trees get too large and the canopy gets too thick and blocks out sunlight. And so actually it's an important part of land management to allow fires occasionally or every few decades to help yourself out. And if you wonder why that is the case, let's look at California. California had a strict policy of avoiding forest fires because they were difficult to contain. And because of that, they have gotten worse and worse forest fires for each of the last 5 to 10 years. And one of the reasons for this was more intense land management in the 1970s, and one of the tenets of that land management was the reduction of fires in the native habitat of California. And this has actually proved to be a major mistake. Michigan, on the other hand, actually practices a process of controlled burns. And in fact, this last summer, I was able to experience and witness one of these controlled burns very close to where I was staying in the UP for a few weeks. And they came into a section of the forest and they kind of marked it off on the roads where they were going to be doing this burn. And they burned large tracts of land. And when I was up there in the UP, they had just burned it, so it was black and charred and ashy. When I go up this year, after the quarantine is over here on May 1st, I'm sure I will find budding green areas as the leaves come out and all these young plants push up. And you'll really, in some ways, not be able to tell that there was a fire there in just a few years. This year, you'll be able to tell, but in 3 years, you'll just think it's an open patch in the woods. But this is actually a very natural thing, and it helps agriculture. It helps you if you are trying to use pieces of the environment to your advantage. And this is what's practiced by the lowland New Guineans. That being said, the lowland New Guineans are going to be competed right out of their practices by the incoming Polynesian peoples that begin to settle in certain parts of New Guinea. Now, the native New Guineans are never pushed out entirely. They continue to survive and they continue to practice their native slash and burn agriculture, but the Polynesians, through intermarriage, through settlement, and through trade, begin to introduce their own staples, not only agricultural products and fishing processes, but also domestic animals, specifically the dog, chicken, and pig, which are going to be introduced to New Guinea. And the pig, especially with its propensity to be able to eat just about anything and produce meat, is going to be a great boon to the lowland New Guineans. And eventually, some of these domestic animals are going to make their way in small numbers to the New Guinea highlands, and they're going to add that to their agricultural process of the taro root. Now, unfortunately, again, because of the lack of writing and the lack of historical sources available to us, we have to fast forward all the way to European discovery of Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea was probably discovered by the Spanish in the 1500s, and it was more closely explored by the Dutch in the 1600s. In fact, the Dutch took possession of the western part of the island in the 1600s and combined it with other areas that we would today call Indonesia, but at that time was called the Dutch East Indies, because it was part of the Spice Island trades. Many Polynesian groups and Southeast Asian groups had settled in Papua New Guinea, primarily along the west coast, and so those settlements were brought into the Dutch orbit. They were brought into the Dutch colony, and they were controlled for the different spices that they could produce. The eastern part of the island was too much work for the Dutch, and there weren't really any major trading settlements that the Dutch were interested in, so the eastern part of the island was primarily left to its own devices until the 1800s. In the 1800s, we have two groups that become very interested in Papua New Guinea. The first are the Germans. The Germans, after having unified in 1871, looked around the world and realized that they were now late to the colonization game, and they felt very, very nervous about the fact that both France and Britain had immense overseas colonial empires, and it seemed like in the 1870s, the only way to be a truly prestigious nation in Europe was to have colonies. And so this would launch Germany into a stage of attempting to acquire whatever land land was not currently claimed. We talked about that briefly when we talked about the acquisition of German colonies in Africa, and we also see the same thing in Papua New Guinea. The northern part of the eastern half of Papua New Guinea becomes German territory. And I know that sounds confusing, but if you want to look up the history of Papua New Guinea on the internet, you'll see a map and one of the first Google Images searches that you can do. I checked just to make sure there's an easy reference for you. So if you're not exactly sure what the upper east portion of Papua New Guinea is, just go ahead and look it up. It's pretty easy to see. The other group that gets interested in Papua New Guinea at this point are the British, because of course if the Germans are there, the British are getting a little nervous, because if you go directly south from Papua New Guinea, you run into Australia, and so the British take the southern eastern portion of Papua New Guinea and actually kind of combine it with the Australian colony. In fact, it's actually an external territory of the Australian Commonwealth once Australia wins or is given by the British Parliament its independent status. And so in some ways, Papua New Guinea is divided in three ways: the top part to the Germans, the bottom part to the Australians, and the entire western part to the Dutch. With the outbreak of World War I, there is conflict in Papua New Guinea. The Australian troops in the southern portion invade the northern portion and drive out the German troops and occupy it. Technically, the northern part then became a mandate of the League of Nations, in other words, a piece of territory controlled by the League of Nations, but in actuality, it became a second part of British territory. This area was controlled by Britain through Australia all the way through World War II. And in World War II, the Japanese invaded all of Papua New Guinea, not only the Dutch side, which quickly fell to them, but also the British side, where the Australians put up a very, very strong defense. And eventually, with American assistance, primarily in the form of supplies and extra troops, the Australians were able to push the Japanese eventually out of the entirety of Papua New Guinea. And the Dutch East Indies was eventually retaken, and that part of the island was turned over to the Indonesian government, which emerged very shortly after World War II. The eastern part of the island, on the other hand, continued to be a possession of Australia. And in fact, many people are surprised to find this out, but the eastern part of Papua New Guinea remains a British/Australian possession all the way until 1975. In 1975, the New Guineans requested their own self-determination and the right to become a nation on their own, and Australia was more than willing to grant this to them. And so they actually became part of the British Commonwealth and their own independent nation. Actually, the Queen of Papua New Guinea is still Queen Elizabeth II. So they have the same monarch as the rest of the British Empire. They are part of the Commonwealth of Nations, which of course pretty much every former part of the British Empire is, with the exception of India, because India and Britain's separation was not exactly on positive terms. Modern-day Papua New Guinea has a number of difficult problems to sort through. Number one, Papua New Guinea has some of the most isolated people groups in all of the world. In fact, Papua New Guinea is in the top 3 of isolated places on the planet Earth. The only places as isolated as Papua New Guinea are the centers of the Congo rainforest and the deep reaches of the Amazon rainforest. Reaching the people of Papua New Guinea is extremely difficult, and I mean reaching as far from a physical perspective, but I also mean from a missions perspective. Papua New Guinea is probably one of the last places on Earth that has not received significant missionary attention, and the main reason for this is the difficulty of arriving in the highlands specifically. The lowlands are difficult enough, and we actually at First Baptist Church of Wexham support missionaries in Papua New Guinea, and they have a difficult enough time, and they're technically lowland Papua New Guinea, and that is technically the easier from a geographical point of view area. If you want to get to the highlands, number one, you need to fly, and you need to invest significant time and resources, and Papua New Guinea is widely acknowledged as one of the most backward places on the planet Earth, or certainly it was from approximately the 1940s through the 1980s. Papua New Guinea had a strong tradition of cannibalism and headhunting. Headhunting is a practice of chopping off your enemy's heads and keeping their skulls basically as trophies. And cannibalism would go right along with that. You eat the person's body basically to take their essence from them. This was very common. Finally, it was outlawed in the 1970s, outlawed. That makes it sound like it was legal. There was a strong campaign to end the practice in the 1970s, and that has largely ended the practice, although there are still some cannibals in the Papua New Guinea highlands. So again, very difficult and trying area for missionaries to attempt to explore, and this has caused several real problems. And in fact, some missionaries have even, if you can believe the stories, been eaten before in their attempt to reach some of these tribes. So a really difficult place to reach. Papua New Guinea also has two major political problems. Number one, it is being slowly invaded by a new colonial power, and that is China. China is not only financing several large industrial projects in Papua New Guinea, but Chinese settlers are arriving and beginning to live in Papua New Guinea, and there are concerns that over the next few decades, as the Chinese population of Papua New Guinea increases, that China will begin to have more and more impact there, and this has led to several anti-Chinese riots from the native Papua New Guineans themselves, because they are having a difficult time to claw their way out of poverty, and many of them feel that the Chinese are simply waiting at the gates to devour the nation as soon as it becomes profitable. The most profitable region of the entire nation, Bougainville, is actually attempting to win its independence. In fact, it just in 2019 had a referendum requesting independence, a referendum that was supported by 98% of the voting population. And so this entire region effectively wants to secede from Papua New Guinea. And this leads to a difficult three-way power struggle. Australia is still the major trade partner and aid giver of Papua New Guinea, and they would prefer that Bougainville stay with New Guinea. Obviously, Papua New Guinea would prefer that Bougainville stayed with New Guinea, since they are responsible for almost 40% of the federal budget and almost 35% of the GDP of the nation. But the Chinese, on the other hand, would love for Bougainville to become independent, and that would give the Chinese an opportunity to form a new alliance, an alliance with a nation that would probably be reasonably prosperous, especially compared to the rest of Papua New Guinea. As far as natural resources, Papua New Guinea has not really been explored thoroughly for mining rights, although there is a significant amount of mining going on there for various important materials. There's also oil off the coast of the islands surrounding it, although that oil has not been largely exploited up to this point. The Dutch East Indies are more famous for their oil resources. Finally, the agriculture of the island primarily is reliant on a South American food product, and that is the sweet potato. The sweet potato replaced taro because it grows in almost the same locations but produces 2 to 3 times more calories per pound of per foot, of area cultivated. And so sweet potatoes are the staple of Papua New Guinean diets, replacing the taro. That's all I have for you guys on Papua New Guinea. I think it's a very interesting place. If you like native cultures and complex interactions and really interesting missionary stories, I highly encourage you to look into Papua New Guinea as your selected culture/location for your worksheet this week. We will finish up in the next lecture talking about a place that very few people live, and that is Antarctica.